I still remember the exact moment my son looked me in the eye on his birthday and told me the best gift I could give him was to disappear from his life. Not in anger, not by accident. He meant it. And what hurt the most was not just the words, but the silence that followed, like everyone already knew something I did not. That was the moment everything inside me shifted, when love stopped being enough and truth finally demanded to be seen. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Ellis. I am 62 years old, and for the first time in my life, I live alone in a house that feels too large for one person and too quiet for a woman who once filled it with a family. The house sits in Scottsdale, Arizona, where the light stretches long across the desert and settles gently against the windows in the evening. It is a beautiful home, designed carefully over the years with my husband, every room shaped with intention, every corner holding a memory that still breathes if I stand still long enough. After my husband passed, the silence became something I learned to live with. It was not peaceful, but it was manageable. I built routines around it. Morning coffee in the kitchen, reading by the window in the afternoon, organizing small things that did not need organizing just to keep my hands busy. I told myself this was enough. I told myself I was enough. Then my son called. Daniel has always been ambitious, the kind of man who moves quickly and believes that things will fall into place because they always have. He told me his business had taken a hit. Real estate had turned against him in ways he had not expected. He said it was temporary. He said he just needed a place to land while he figured things out. He did not ask directly, but he did not need to. I had already decided before he finished speaking. He arrived a week later with Claire and their daughter, Lily. The house changed the moment they walked in. Suitcases rolled across the floor. Voices filled the hallway. Lily ran from room to room, her laughter light and unguarded, touching spaces that had been quiet for years. For a brief moment, I felt something close to relief. The house was alive again. At first, everything felt natural. We shared meals. We talked in the evenings. Claire was polite, careful with her words, always composed. Daniel thanked me more than once, which I noticed because it was rare. I allowed myself to believe that this was temporary, that I was helping my son stand back up. The changes began small enough that I did not question them. Daniel mentioned that the master bedroom would be easier for them, more space for Lily. It made sense when he said it, so I moved my things into the guest room without argument. It was only for a while. Then my office became Lily's playroom. My files were stacked into boxes and pushed against the wall. My desk, once clear and ordered, disappeared under coloring books and plastic toys. I told myself it was harmless. She was a child. She needed space. The living room followed. Daniel set up his work there. Papers spread across the coffee table. Phone calls taken at all hours. Claire began reorganizing the kitchen, adjusting where things belonged, explaining it was more efficient this way. She did not ask. She informed. I noticed, but I did not stop it. Each change felt too small to resist on its own. Together, they formed something I could not ignore, but by then it was already in place. One evening, I stood in the hallway and realized I was hesitating before entering my own living room. Not because I was unwelcome, but because I no longer knew how I fit into the space. The house was still mine in every legal sense, but something quieter, something harder to name, had already begun to shift. If you're still watching and this moment made you feel something shift, comment number 1 below so I know you're here with me. Now, let's move on to what started to feel not quite right. The unease did not arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like dust you do not notice until the light catches it just right. After the first few weeks of adjustment, I began to sense that something in the house was no longer aligned with me, though I could not yet name it. It started with small things. Emails I was certain I had not opened were already marked as read. At first, I assumed I had simply forgotten. I had been distracted more often lately, moving between rooms that no longer felt entirely mine. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it was age, or fatigue, or the quiet disorientation that comes when routines are disrupted. Then there were the bank statements. I sat at the kitchen counter one morning, tracing a line of transactions I did not remember making. The amounts were not large enough to alarm me immediately, but they repeated with a pattern that felt deliberate. I went back through older statements and found more of the same. Each one small, each one easy to overlook. Together, they formed something I could not easily explain away. I checked my drawers that afternoon. Papers had shifted slightly, not enough to suggest disorder, but enough that I noticed. A folder I kept at the back was now closer to the front. A document I had placed face down was turned upward. It was the kind of change that would mean nothing to anyone else. To me, it felt like someone had been standing in my space while I was not there. Claire's voice became another detail I could not ignore. She spent more time on the phone than before, always in that same careful tone, soft and measured. When I entered the room, her sentences would end abruptly or change direction. Once, I passed by the hallway and heard her say the words, care facility and timing in the same breath. Another time, she mentioned transition. The conversations were never complete enough for me to understand, but they left behind a shape that I could feel even after the words were gone. I did not ask her about it. That was the part I understood most clearly about myself. I chose silence because asking would force something into the open, and I was not ready to see it yet. Lily remained the only part of the house that felt unchanged. She still ran to me with drawings, still asked for help finding things she had misplaced, still spoke without calculation. When she sat beside me, the unease faded just enough for me to pretend it had never been there. But even that did not last. One afternoon, I found my mail already opened and stacked neatly on the counter. Claire explained it had arrived while I was out, and she thought it would be helpful to sort it. She smiled when she said it, the same composed expression she wore in every situation. I thanked her, because that was what I always did. By the time Daniel's birthday approached, I had begun to feel like a guest moving carefully through someone else's home. Still, I prepared the dinner myself. I set the table the way I always had, placing each plate with quiet precision, arranging the glasses so they caught the light just right. I even wrapped a small gift for him, something simple, something thoughtful. I wanted the evening to feel normal, or at least close enough that no one would notice the difference. Family gathered, voices filled the room, and for a brief moment I believed I could hold everything together through effort alone. Then Daniel looked at me across the table and said that the best gift I could give him was to be out of his life. The words landed without warning, but what struck me more than the sentence itself was the silence that followed. No one corrected him. No one laughed it off. Claire did not look surprised. She set her glass down slowly, as if she had been expecting the moment to arrive. I felt the shock, but it passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, a kind of clarity that left no room for denial. This was not a careless remark. It had been chosen. And in that instant, I understood that what I had been sensing for weeks was not confusion or imagination. It was the edge of something already in motion, finally revealing itself in plain sight. If you're starting to notice the warning signs and it's pulling you in deeper, comment number 2 below to stay with me. Now, let's see how everything began to unravel. Daniel's words were still hanging in the air when I realized something inside me had already shifted. The shock had passed faster than I would have expected, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost unfamiliar. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask him to explain. Instead, I looked around the table and saw what I had not allowed myself to see before. No one reacted. There were no gasps, no attempts to correct him, no nervous laughter to soften what he had said. Claire sat perfectly composed, her fingers resting lightly against her glass, her expression unchanged. That was the moment I understood this had not been spontaneous. It had been expected. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. The movement drew a few uncertain glances, but no one spoke. I walked to the drawer beside the counter, the same one I had opened earlier that afternoon, and took out the folder I had prepared. It felt heavier now, not because of the paper, but because of what it confirmed. When I returned to the table, I placed the folder at the center without a word. Daniel let out a short laugh, the kind he used when he thought something was beneath him. He leaned back in his chair, watching me as if I were about to perform something dramatic for the room. Claire reached for the folder before anyone else could, flipping it open with quick, controlled movements that began to lose their precision as she turned each page. I did not rush her. The first set of documents were the bank statements, highlighted lines, repeated over months, each one a withdrawal I had never authorized. The amounts were small enough to hide, but consistent enough to reveal intent. Claire's fingers tightened around the paper as she moved to the next section. Printed emails followed. Conversations between her and a real estate agent discussing the value of this house, my house, as if it were already part of a transaction waiting to be completed. There was no hesitation in her language, no uncertainty, only planning. Then came the final set, intake forms from a care facility. My name typed neatly into every required space, dates left blank, ready to be filled. Claire stopped turning pages. Daniel leaned forward then, his smile beginning to fade, though not entirely gone. He still believed this could be dismissed, reframed, turned back in his favor. I could see it in the way he looked at me, waiting for me to break first. Before either of them could speak, Lily's voice rose softly from the end of the table. She was holding her fork loosely, her attention moving between us with quiet confusion. She asked if she would get the upstairs room when I moved out. The room fell silent in a different way. There was no longer any space for denial, no room left for explanations that might soften what had been revealed. A child does not invent a future like that. She repeats what she has heard often enough to believe it. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not even surprise, but a kind of grief that settled deeper than either of those things. This had not been a plan formed in secrecy. It had been spoken aloud, normalized, folded into everyday conversation until it became real for them. I looked at Lily and offered her the only kindness I could in that moment, a calm expression that did not place any of this weight on her. She had done nothing wrong. When I lifted my eyes back to Daniel and Claire, the balance in the room had already shifted. "These are copies," I said quietly. "Everything has been documented." My voice did not shake. It did not rise. It simply existed, steady and clear in a space that had lost all of its earlier certainty. Daniel did not laugh again. For the first time that evening, he looked at me as if he were no longer entirely sure who he was dealing with, and I knew, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever this had been before, it was no longer something I would endure. If that moment hit harder than you expected, and you can feel the tension building, comment number 3 below, so I know you're still following. Now, let's get into what changed everything. The house did not return to normal after that night. It settled into something quieter, but heavier, as if every room was holding its breath. No one mentioned what had happened at the table, yet it lingered in every movement, and every glance that lasted a second too long. I woke early the next morning, long before anyone else came downstairs. The light had just begun to stretch across the kitchen floor when I sat at the table with the documents spread neatly in front of me. My coffee had gone cold before I remembered to take a sip. I was not thinking about comfort. I was thinking about order. Harold Bennett had already called. He did not waste time with sympathy. He asked for details, confirmed what I had gathered, and began outlining the steps that needed to be taken. His voice was steady, grounded in process rather than emotion. That steadiness helped me more than anything else could have. By mid-morning, the first actions were already in place. Every account connected to my name was secured. Access points were reviewed and closed where they should never have been open. Passwords were changed. Authorizations were revoked. Each step felt less like a reaction and more like a correction, as though I were restoring something that had been quietly altered over time. The house itself required the same attention. Ownership documents were moved into a legal structure that could not be touched without my direct consent. Physical papers were gathered and stored properly, no longer left in drawers that others could open. I worked through each task without rushing, without hesitation. At some point, I understood that this was no longer about what had been said at the dinner table. It was no longer about tone or respect or even family. It had become something defined by evidence, by protection, by decisions that would carry consequences whether I welcomed them or not. That evening, I asked Daniel and Claire to come into the kitchen. There were no guests this time, no extended family, no audience to shape the moment. Just the three of us under a single overhead light. The space felt smaller than usual, contained, as if it would not allow anything unnecessary to enter. I placed a single sheet of paper on the table and slid it toward them. "You have 14 days, I said. Claire's reaction came first. She let out a short breath that almost resembled a laugh, though there was nothing amused in it. She said I was being unreasonable, that I was overreacting, that I needed to think about what I was doing to my own family. Her voice carried the same softness she used on the phone, but it no longer held the same control. Daniel tried a different approach. He spoke more carefully, choosing his words as if they might still shape the outcome. He talked about Lily, about stability, about how difficult things had already been. He did not mention the documents. He did not mention what had led us here. I listened, but I did not respond to any of it. "This is not a discussion," I said finally. "It is a notice." The words settled between us with a weight that could not be redirected. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. For the first time, I was not speaking as someone asking to be heard. I was stating what would happen. Daniel went quiet then, not in acceptance, but in calculation. I could see it in the way he looked at the paper, as if trying to find the point where this could still be undone. He had spent years believing I would always bend, always adjust, always make space for him. This time, I did not. When I stood and gathered the remaining documents, neither of them tried to stop me. There was nothing left to argue over, at least not in that moment. The deadline had been set. And as I walked away from the table, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not relief, not satisfaction, but certainty. Whatever came next would not change the fact that this line, once drawn, would not be moved again. If you can sense that something bigger is about to happen and you're fully invested now, comment number 4 below to keep going. Now, let's step into the turning point. The house changed in the days after the notice, though no one spoke about it directly. Conversations became shorter, movements more deliberate, doors closed more often. Even the air felt divided, as if each room belonged to a different version of the same life, no longer connected in any meaningful way. I moved through it all with a quiet awareness that had sharpened since that night. I was no longer trying to hold anything together. I was watching, observing the patterns that revealed themselves when people realized they were losing control. On the third afternoon of the countdown, I returned home earlier than expected. My appointment had ended ahead of schedule, and I decided not to stop anywhere else. The driveway was empty except for Daniel's car. As I approached the side entrance, I heard his voice before I reached the door. I paused without thinking. He was outside, somewhere near the back patio, speaking in a tone I had not heard from him in years. It was lower, tighter, stripped of the ease he used around me. There was pressure in it, something contained but close to breaking. At first, I could only make out fragments, numbers, deadlines, words like liability and extension. I stepped closer, just enough to hear clearly without being seen. His business was not recovering. It was collapsing faster than he had admitted. He had taken on obligations he could not meet, guarantees that were now turning against him. The timeline he spoke of was short, measured in days, not months. Without additional collateral, he would lose everything he had tried to build. I stood there, listening as the pieces aligned, but it was not the financial details that settled into me. It was the way he spoke about me. He said I would agree. He said I always did. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt, only certainty shaped by years of experience. He spoke as if my response had already been decided, as if I were a step in a process rather than a person who might choose differently. Then he mentioned the dinner. He described it not as a mistake, not as something said in anger, but as a strategy. He had chosen the setting, the timing, the presence of others. He had believed I would not challenge him in front of family. He had expected silence, compliance, the same pattern he had relied on for most of his life. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to gather strength, but to let the truth settle fully into place. This had not begun with pressure from Claire. It had not grown out of desperation alone. It had been planned, considered, executed with the assumption that I would respond exactly as I always had. When he ended the call, I stepped back quietly and entered through the front door instead. I did not want him to know what I had heard. Not yet. There was nothing left to confront in the way I once would have. There was only a decision to carry through. That evening, I asked them to meet me in the kitchen again. The same space, the same table, but everything within it had shifted. I did not bring a folder this time. I did not need additional proof. If you are still here after 14 days, I said, legal action will begin immediately. Claire reacted first, her composure breaking into visible frustration. She spoke quickly, accusing me of taking things too far, of turning a family situation into something cold and formal. Her words moved faster than her control. Daniel did not interrupt her. He was watching me, measuring something he had not needed to consider before. All documentation is secured, I continued. From this point forward, everything is recorded. There was no threat in my voice, only fact. For the first time, I saw the shift in him. Not guilt, not regret, recognition. He was beginning to understand that I was no longer responding in ways he could predict. I stood there for a moment longer, then turned away without waiting for an answer. As I walked out of the kitchen, I felt the final piece fall into place inside me. Whatever remained between us, whatever history we shared, no longer held the shape it once had. And I understood, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that the person I had raised and the man standing in my house were no longer the same. By the middle of the countdown, the house had settled into a strange and divided rhythm. We moved around one another without truly interacting, as if invisible lines had been drawn through each room. Daniel stayed mostly in the living room, surrounded by papers and constant calls. Claire kept to the kitchen and the upstairs space, her movements precise, her voice lowered whenever she spoke on the phone. I remained where I needed to be, but no longer where I was expected. There was no more tension in the way people often imagine it, no raised voices or open arguments. What replaced it was colder, defined, final in a way that did not require repetition. Harold called that morning with an update. His tone remained consistent, grounded in facts that did not bend for emotion. He confirmed what I had already begun to understand. The unauthorized use of my financial identity and the attempt to leverage my property were not small matters. They were serious enough to carry consequences far beyond this house. If I intervened, I could delay those consequences, possibly soften them. But I would also be placing everything I owned at risk. After the call ended, I sat for a long time without moving. Not because I was unsure, but because I was allowing myself to fully acknowledge what the decision meant. There had always been a part of me that believed I would choose my son, no matter the cost. That belief had shaped most of my life. It had guided every compromise, every moment I chose to give instead of hold back. Now it stood in front of me as a question I could not avoid. That afternoon, Lily found me in the hallway outside what used to be my office. She held a piece of paper in her hands, something she had drawn, though she did not show it to me right away. She asked if things were going to go back to normal. Her voice was quiet, careful, in a way children become when they sense something shifting around them. I knelt slightly so I could meet her at eye level. I told her that she had done nothing wrong. It was the only truth that mattered in that moment. She nodded, though I could see she did not fully understand. Then she walked away, leaving me alone with a question that no longer needed to be answered aloud. Later that day, I finalized the education fund. Every detail was structured with intention. The account was secure, restricted in a way that ensured only Lily would benefit from it in the future. No withdrawals could be made by her parents. No adjustments could be negotiated. It was protection, not an extension of anything they could claim. That distinction mattered. That night, Daniel came to me. His tone was different, softer, as if he had set aside the urgency he carried during his calls. He spoke about pressure, about how quickly things had unraveled, about responsibilities that had grown beyond what he could manage. He did not mention the documents. He did not acknowledge what had been done. I listened without interruption, recognizing the pattern even as it unfolded. This was not accountability. It was adjustment. A shift in approach meant to reach the same outcome. I am not changing my decision, I said. The words were quiet, but they did not need emphasis. They were complete as they were. He stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for something else to follow. When nothing did, he nodded once and stepped back. I remained where I was, feeling the last of that earlier belief settle and fade, not with force, not with anger, but with a clarity that did not leave space for it to return. For the first time, I was no longer choosing between myself and my son. I had already chosen. If you've made it this far and you can feel there's no going back anymore, comment number 6 below so I know you're still with me. Now, let's move into Chapter 7, where consequences finally arrive. The 14th morning arrived without ceremony. I woke before sunrise, not because I could not sleep, but because I no longer needed to wait. The house was still, the kind of quiet that settles just before something ends. For a moment, I stood in the hallway and listened, aware that this would be the last time the house held all of us under the same roof. When I opened the curtains, the moving truck was already parked along the curb. It did not surprise me. The timeline had been clear. What mattered was not whether they were ready, but that the day had come. I moved through the kitchen as I always did, preparing coffee, setting a cup on the counter, though I barely touched it. My routine remained intact, even as everything around it shifted. By the time the sun rose higher, the house had begun to stir. Doors opened. Footsteps crossed the floor with purpose instead of hesitation. There was no attempt to maintain appearances anymore. The separation that had formed over the past days was now fully visible. Claire was the first to break the silence. Her voice carried through the hallway, sharper than it had been before, stripped of the careful control she usually maintained. She spoke about fairness, about family, about what she believed this would do to Lily. The words came quickly, layered with accusation, but they no longer reached me in the way they once might have. I did not respond. There was nothing left to explain. Every step had already been taken with clarity. Every decision had been made before this morning arrived. Daniel moved differently. The confidence that had defined him at the beginning was gone, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue in the same way. Instead, he watched the process unfold as if he were still trying to find a place where it could be interrupted. Boxes were carried out one at a time. Items that had filled the house over months disappeared in a steady, orderly rhythm. The living room began to clear first, the space opening in a way that felt unfamiliar after so long. Then the upstairs, then the kitchen, each room returning piece by piece to something closer to what it had been. I remained present, but not involved. I stood where I needed to stand, observing without directing, allowing the process to move forward without interference. At one point, Daniel stepped closer. He spoke quietly, not with the force he had used before, but with something closer to appeal. He said they could fix this, that it did not have to end like this. The words were simple, but they carried the same assumption that had always been there beneath everything else. "You had 14 days," I said. That was all. He did not respond immediately. He only nodded once, as if acknowledging something he could no longer argue against. Lily stood near the door with her small backpack, her eyes moving between us, trying to understand what had changed and why it could not be undone. She did not cry. She simply watched, absorbing more than anyone intended her to. When the last box was loaded, the house fell into a brief, suspended silence. Claire left first, her movements quick, her attention fixed forward. Daniel followed more slowly, pausing for a moment at the edge of the driveway before continuing on. The truck pulled away without ceremony. I stepped back inside as the locksmith arrived. He worked efficiently, replacing each lock with practiced precision. When he handed me the new keys, the finality of the moment settled in fully. The house was quiet again, but this time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt earned. When the door closed behind the locksmith, the house settled into a silence I had not heard in a long time. I stood in the entryway for several moments, listening to it, letting it move through the walls without interruption. It was not the same quiet I had lived with before Daniel returned. That silence had carried loneliness. This one carried something steadier, something that felt earned. I moved through the house slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to see it clearly again. Each room held traces of what had been there only hours before. The living room felt larger without the stacks of papers and constant movement. The kitchen counters were clear, no longer rearranged to suit someone else's rhythm. Upstairs, the air felt lighter, though it still carried the faint outline of a life that had tried to settle into place. I began with the master bedroom. My belongings had been boxed and moved aside months ago, placed into smaller spaces as if they were temporary by nature. I carried them back one piece at a time, setting each item where it had originally belonged. The bed was returned to its position near the window. The dresser cleared, the closet reorganized with a quiet precision that did not require urgency. There was no rush. The space would wait for me now. The office took longer. When I opened the door, I paused briefly. The room had been transformed into something unrecognizable, filled with remnants of a child's presence. Toys, scattered papers, bright colors layered over the structure I once maintained so carefully. I did not remove everything at once. I worked through it gradually, stacking items neatly, placing them into boxes without frustration. At the back of the desk, I found a drawing. It was Lily's. The lines were uneven, the colors bright and uncontained. The house stood at the center, larger than everything around it. Above it, in careful, uneven letters, she had written, "Our house." I held the paper longer than I expected. There was no anger in what I felt, only a quiet recognition of how deeply the assumption had settled. It had not lived only in conversations between adults or in documents hidden in folders. It had reached a child's understanding, shaping the way she saw the world around her. I placed the drawing aside carefully, not discarding it, but not returning it to where it had been. Later that afternoon, Harold called to confirm that everything had been secured. The trust was in place. The accounts were protected. The education fund for Lily had been finalized, structured in a way that ensured it could not be accessed or altered by anyone else. It would remain untouched until she was old enough to use it herself. That detail mattered more than I expected. It allowed me to separate what needed to be separated. My decision regarding Daniel and Claire remained firm, unchanged by time or distance. But Lily was not part of that decision. She would not carry consequences that were never hers to begin with. As evening settled, I sat in the office with the window open, letting the air move freely through the space. The room felt like mine again, not because everything had been restored perfectly, but because it no longer resisted me. There was no sense of victory in that moment. Only alignment. The house, at last, reflected the life I had chosen to keep. If you're still here and you feel the weight of everything that has happened, comment number 8 below to stay until the end. Now, let's move into the final outcome of this story. A few days passed in a quiet rhythm that no longer felt fragile. The house had settled into its restored shape, and I moved through it without hesitation, no longer adjusting myself to fit around someone else's presence. There was a steadiness in that routine, but beneath it, I remained aware that something had not fully concluded. Late one afternoon, as the light began to soften against the windows, the doorbell rang. I did not startle. I had expected it, though I could not have said exactly when it would happen. I set aside what I was doing and walked to the door with the same measured pace I had carried through the past weeks. Daniel stood on the porch. He was alone. The difference in him was immediate. His posture had lost its earlier certainty, his shoulders drawn tighter, his expression marked by something heavier than frustration. There was no trace of the ease he once carried into every room. I opened the door but did not step aside. Instead, I moved just outside and closed the screen behind me, leaving the boundary intact. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he began, not with anger, but with explanation. He spoke about how quickly things had unraveled, about the pressure that had built faster than he could manage. His business had not simply slowed, it had collapsed in ways he had not prepared for. There were obligations he could not meet, decisions that had narrowed into consequences he could no longer avoid. I listened without interrupting. There was no urgency in me to respond, no need to correct or guide the direction of his words. I had already heard what mattered before he arrived. This was not new information. It was only the first time he had said it without assuming I would resolve it for him. At one point, he paused, looking past me briefly as if searching for something familiar inside the house. Then he said that he had not believed I would follow through. The sentence was simple, but it carried everything. I felt no anger as it settled between us, only a clear recognition of what had always been true. His expectation had never been based on trust or respect. It had been built on repetition, on the certainty that I would continue to respond the same way I always had. He spoke again, more carefully this time, shifting toward what he needed rather than what had happened. He did not ask directly, but the request was present in everything he said. He was looking for a way back, not necessarily into the house, but into the pattern that had always supported him. "I am not going to help you," I said. The words were steady, without emphasis or hesitation. He nodded slowly, as if he had already known the answer, but needed to hear it spoken. There was no argument, no attempt to push further, only a quiet acknowledgement that the path he had relied on was no longer available. After a moment, he asked if there would ever be a point where I might forgive him. I did not answer in the way he expected. Instead, I reminded him of what he had asked of me, that I step out of his life. What had followed was not a reaction, but a completion of that request. He stood there for a few seconds longer, then turned and walked down the path without looking back. I watched until he reached the end of the driveway, then stepped inside and closed the door. This time, the silence that followed did not carry anything unfinished. After I closed the door, I remained there for a moment, my hands still resting lightly against the surface as if I could feel the shift that had just taken place. Outside, the light was beginning to fade, stretching into the quiet of early evening. Inside, the house held steady around me, no longer unsettled, no longer uncertain. I walked through each room slowly, not searching for anything, but acknowledging what was there. The living room felt open again, no longer shaped by someone else's urgency. The kitchen had returned to its natural order, every object where I had chosen to place it. Upstairs, the air moved freely through spaces that no longer carried tension. When I reached the office, I paused. The desk was clear, the chair set near the window where I had always kept it. In the drawer, beneath a stack of neatly arranged papers, I found the drawing again. Lily's small, careful lines, the house standing larger than everything around it. This time, the words above it were different. Grandma's house. I traced the letters lightly with my finger, not correcting them, not questioning how or when they had changed. The meaning was simple, but it carried more weight than anything that had been said aloud in recent days. I set the drawing back in its place and closed the drawer. There was no sense of victory in what I had done, no moment of triumph waiting at the end of it. What remained was quieter than that, but far more solid. I had not removed love from my life. I had removed the expectation that love required me to surrender everything I had. The two are not the same. I understood now that boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are the shape that allows something to exist without being consumed. Without them, even the strongest bonds begin to distort, to take more than they give, to turn into something unrecognizable. As the last of the daylight slipped away, I sat by the window, the house steady around me, aligned in a way it had not been for years. For the first time in a long while, nothing needed to be adjusted. Everything was exactly where it belonged. In the end, not every loss is meant to be repaired, and not every relationship is meant to return to what it once was. Sometimes, clarity arrives not as comfort, but as truth, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. There are moments in life when holding on costs more than letting go, when love must be redefined not by sacrifice, but by self-respect. Boundaries are not walls built out of bitterness. They are lines drawn to preserve what remains whole. And in choosing to honor those lines, something unexpected takes shape, a life that no longer bends under the weight of expectation, but stands on its own foundation. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, do not forget to follow and subscribe.